So in this section, we are going to talk about story mapping, or you could call it story plotting. And what it is just taking your story and mapping out the scenes and events that are going to occur to figure out what scenes that you need to tell the story well and what scenes that you don't need. It helps you get a big picture of the story as a whole, and you can see it all develop before you ever start writing. This is a great thing to do before you just sit down and start writing in front of a screen, because sometimes you might think, oh, this idea is great, I'm just going to start writing. But then you find yourself hitting all these mental blocks and there's problems and you can't figure out where to go next. So story mapping helps you get a big picture of the story so that you understand it as a whole and not just in little pieces, or maybe the beginning and the end, but you don't know what the middle is. So rather than get stuck trying to figure out your story, story mapping is going to help you figure out the whole thing, and it makes you far more likely to be able to get through the whole story without running into some serious mental blocks, what they would call writer's block. It'll help you avoid all that. So we're going to look at different ways that you can do story mapping, but it all is going to kind of boil around the same thing. It's just different processes. And so we've used all of these here. I've personally used all of them, and they all work in different ways. You have to decide which one works best for you. And if you know what, if these three are not your favorite, you might think of your own. I know some people do this using iPads, using other things, and they've come up with different apps for different things that people have used. And that's great and all well and good, but we're going to teach you some three really basic, easy ways to do it. And so that way you can get going and have a much more successful feel on how to do this, and then you can develop it all you want. So let's just talk a little bit. We're going to get going here on story mapping. All right, so story mapping. So when you map your story, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking the story scene by scene and putting it together and figuring out where everything goes. So when you start your story, you know, obviously, okay, you're going to have your setup section, if my marker will write. You have your setup, you're going to have your introductory conflict, your inciting incident right there sometime pretty early at the beginning. From your inciting incident, you know that the character is going to have to start his own story where he's going to have to do something. He's going to have to leave his balanced world and start dealing with the conflict. And then from there, we're going to go into a series of ever-increasing conflicts toward what is going to be inevitably a final climax. And then eventually, we're going to be coming out to a resolution. We'll just put RES up there. So there's a resolution. So you know when you start that your story is going to somehow fill in this kind of thing. So we're going to need setup. We're going to need to figure out what the inciting incident is. We're going to figure out his response. We're going to figure out the different hurdles. And then we're going to figure out the resolution. Now, when you're mapping out your story, you may know how you want the story to end. You may know how you want it to begin. And there might just be some holes in the middle that you don't know. Or perhaps you know how the story begins, but you have no idea how this thing is going to end. And you know what? That's okay, because when you map it this way, you're going to kind of pick it out piece by piece and put it together. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the card method. I've known a bunch of people that use the card method, and what they do is they have these simple 3x5 note cards. You can pick them up at CVS, Hobby Lobby, I mean just pretty much anywhere. The grocery store will have note cards. And some people like them with lines. I personally like them when they're blank. Just kind of, blank page. It's pretty that way. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a card, and every time you take a card, it's going to represent a scene. I know, believe it or not. So you're going to have a card, and it's going to represent a scene. So I'll draw the card up here for right now. So you got your card, it's blank, and it's going to represent a scene. So now when you're looking at your card, you're going to think, okay, well, we need to write down what's going to happen. So let's pretend that on this card, it's going to tell us what the inciting incident is. What is the conflict that gets the whole thing going? So right here in the middle of the card, normally what I would do is I would leave a section about like this. And this is going to be a description. That's a description of everything that's going to happen in the scene. And I'm going to just kind of write down a simple way for me to remember what happens in the scene. And I'm going to write it right there. And then here at the top corner of this page, I might put II, because this is going to be our inciting incident. That way I know where this card fits, right? So I'm going to put there. I might put over here, I'm going to put just character here. So characters. My writing is so great. I might put the characters that are involved in the top corner. And then what I'm really going to do, make it really interesting, is As always, every good scene has conflict in it, and every good scene needs to push our character toward his goal or away from it. So I might just indicate on the bottom, you can do it a couple different ways. You can do a plus or you could do a minus, and you can say, okay, positive, this is ending positively, it's gonna push him one way, or it's gonna go minus, or you could put maybe an arrow. Some people use arrows and it can either go up or down. The conflict is going up, or maybe the conflict is now the pressure is easing off. You can, so plus or minus, maybe an arrow up, arrow down. You can put that on the card. And the last thing I like to put on mine is just the risk. Whatever is at stake in this particular scene, I'll label it and put it at the bottom of the card. That way, when I look at the card, I can get an overall idea of, is this scene, who's involved with it, where does this card represent on the place, on our story map. It tells me kind of what's going on in the scene. It tells me what the risk is that's involved in the scene. And it's going to tell me, is conflict going up? Is it going down? And the reason why I want to know if the conflict is going up and down is because the next card, if I had another card, and I'm going to line them all up, the next card, if this card went up and conflict went up, and this card, the conflict went up, eventually I need to take the pressure off of my poor protagonist and give him some form of relief before I get to the next bigger conflict. Because again, you want this kind of environment. You want the conflict to go up and down, where he has a small victory, and then up and down and up and down. You want it to be ever increasing, moving up in conflict. So then by the time I get to this card, I can give our protagonist a break and say, all right, now the conflict is going down. So what you're gonna do is you end up with a whole series of cards, you know, for a book, every scene figured out, just like this. It's gonna look, see, I've got characters, description, plus, minus, risk right here on the card. You might not be able to see it very well, but there it is nonetheless. And then what you're gonna end up doing is you can have your whole stack of all your scenes and you can lay them out one after the other. And that way you can piece your story together like so. And that way you can actually put it on a table, stand back and say, okay, wait a minute, I can see this whole entire story all laid out here in front of me, and I can ask myself questions. Is there too much rising pressure here? Do I need to give him a break sooner? Maybe I need to switch the cards around. Or maybe, you know what, this is a great scene, but it would be better earlier in the story rather than later in the story. So the reason why some people like the cards so much is because it's really easy to write your scenes down, and then you can easily just move them around right in front of you and see the story change right in front of you because you have all the pieces. And so as you get your stories, you got your inciting incident, you've got, you know, rising conflict here, you've got maybe your setup card over here, and then at the end, of course, you have your card where you have the final resolution, and then instead of arrows, it just says the end, because now you have your whole story. So the card method, really useful. It's great for being able to stand back, look at it, and what's really fun about it is once you get all your cards drawn, you can say, hey, you know, grab a friend, come on in and say, I want to walk you through this story. Let me tell you about it. It starts out like this, and then you can just verbally look at your cards and explain the story to somebody, get instant feedback from them, and they might be able to say, well, I think that, you know, you need to move this card to here and give it a twist ending or something, I don't know. And so that's a great way to move forward with the card process. But now let's look at the journal method. Now the journal method is very much like the cards method. It's the same idea, except rather than cards, you just have a sketchbook or notebook kind of like this. You can get a legal pad, a journal, whatever it is, and it's a blank page in front of you. And so what I would like to do is I like to write scenes. And so let's pretend, so that you can see it a little better, I will pretend that this is my board up here. What I like to do is I like to draw scenes, and I will connect them with arrows that go like this. And I will just write them down on the board, and I will keep going. And at the end of the scene, I can actually just quickly note down the arrows. Is the scene going up? Is it going down? And things like that. I ask myself, well, what's the risk? But the easy thing about this is that you can actually write it linearly, start to finish. So I'm going to start with my setup. So my first few boxes are just going to tell me, I'm going to start with, what do I need to know to start this? So I have my first box here. Here's a sketch note about what I need to know. And here's a sketch note about what I need to know. And then right there, I can have, boom, this is where my inciting incident is going to happen. My II. Let's do that so you can see a little better. So I only need 2 cards for setup, 2 little, I'm sorry, not cards. You only need 2 little spots for setup and then that leads you to your inciting incident. Now, if you do this with a pencil, if you need to move a scene around, you can just erase it. But sometimes the nice thing is, as you're drawing all your little boxes and you've got all your little arrows moving around, at the end of it, you have it all on one page, and that way you can see it all kind of unfold. There it is, boom, on the page, not a big deal. And you can kind of look at it, and if you need to write it again or change something else, you can just erase it or start a new chart and get it all on one page. It can be really convenient, and some people, it's just a little easier to start with a blank sheet of paper rather than cards, and it just feels a lot better. Personally, this is the one that I use the most. I like it. I have tons of books that are filled with arrows all over the place, kind of guiding me through the various parts of the story. And then at the tops, I'll just kind of make other notes. So a lot of the times what I'll do is I'll write all my notes in black, and then above them in blue or red, I will kind of write risks involved, what's going on, how they're connecting with other blocks on the page. And so that's the one that I probably use the most. But we don't want to just leave that out. We can also use the whiteboard method, which is the same kind of thing. The whiteboard method is you take a whiteboard like this. It's really simple. You can erase it, and basically you just start out and you say, all right, here's a scene, here's a scene, here's a scene, here's a scene. I want to move this, so you just erase it, say, all right, I'm going to move it to here, and you can map out the whole thing on a board. But all three methods basically have the same idea. You're going to have a scene description. You want to keep track of where the individual events are happening, what part of the story they're landing in, and you want to be able to match them up with parts of the story. Where are these things going? Where is, what is changing? Where do they fit in? You don't want to have your resolution moment written on the board or the card early, because well, once that happens, the story's over. So after that card, there shouldn't be any other cards. So whether you like a notebook or a whiteboard or cards, all the processes work the same. You're just trying to develop your scenes, figuring out the necessary scenes to move on. So what we're going to do for you is we are going to story map for you the Butter Battle Book, and we're going to put it in all three ways. We're going to show you how we would take this book, break it up scene by scene, and explain how we would do it if it was on a whiteboard, if it was on a notebook, or if it was on note cards. So we're going to do that. We're going to post those all in a link below. You can see the pictures down there, and that way you can say, oh, this is how they're doing it. This is what it looks like. This is how it might be helpful. And so for you, you can get it. You can practice that on your own. If you want to get a book and do it on your own, you can do it with us with this book, or you can just take a look for some examples and see how that works.